Welcome back to Fusion 360 for Woodworkers. Today we're going to turn our attention to rendering inside Fusion. That sounds good? Stick around. So we're nearly coming to the end of the project now. There's two key things I want to do. Today I want to focus on rendering, creating that photorealistic picture that we can share with our customers and get a feel for how our project's going to look once we've built it. Then the final stage for next week's episode is looking how we create the engineering drawings for our workshop. Let's get straight into it and start to look at rendering. So here we are, here's our diagram where we left it. The only change I've made, I've just put a small chamfer on the outside of the doors here. I think you can see that exactly the same way I did on the drawer. It was a chamfer command, all the outside edges, and I just did it to the joinery thickness, i.e. a third of our stock. So our bookcase is looking really good now. What I want to do now is to create a photorealistic rendering of our unit. And in fact, this is one of the great features of Fusion. It had it built in. It was one of those features that first attracted me to working on Fusion in the first place, because I wanted to be able to create something that looked good that I could share with our customers. Come up to the top left hand corner into where it says design, and we're going to change the workspace. So click on the down arrow, and we looked at these in episode 1, and the one that we want to talk about is rendering. Render workspace generates realistic renderings of the design. Click on that and it brings up a new window for us. You can see on the left hand side you've still got all the various components, and I can still turn those components on and off by using the eyes. So if you wanted to select individual components to render, then be my guest and crack on to do it. You see you've got a very simplified menu at the top. I've got setup, I've got in canvas render, and I've got render, and we'll look at those in a second. You can see at the bottom my timeline has gone, but I do have this rendering gallery. So as I start to create pictures, an archive of pictures will appear down here. So if you did want to go ahead and say, hey, I just wanted to do a base panel, you could do a rendering of that, then that would appear here. I then want to do the top panel, do rendering of that, and that would appear in the gallery. So you could break it down in that way. Not something I've ever wanted to do, but hey, that's cool. So let's look at it. The first thing you want to do is to set up your model. Now the first command on this is appearance. You've then got the scene settings. You've then got the decal, and we can put different graphics onto our design, such as the Woodgrafter logo. And then you've got texture map controls. Now the order I go into, first of all, is I tend to complete the appearance, and then I do the texture map controls, and then I do the scene rendering. And very often I don't bother putting a transfer on it. If you extend the menu, the only additional one you get is physical material. Now the appearance and the physical material do exactly the same with exactly the same menu that we looked at when we designed this. But let's have a look at it anyway. If I pull out my drawers, notice that my drawers inside are actually still grey. We haven't actually given those any sort of material. So I can come into my appearance menu, select that, and we get exactly the same menu that we've seen previously. So I can simply say, what do I want these to be? Well, we're working on pine. That's already in my short menu. So let's bring that down and say I want my small drawer to be pine. And straight away you can see it's selected all the material on my small drawer. I want my large drawer to be pine. I want my next large drawer to be pine, and I want my next large drawer to be pine, and I want my final small drawer to be pine. So the first thing you can do is to create the appearance on these components. Excellent stuff. Have we that done? Close it down. Now I don't tend to use physical material here, but if you did want to come along and say, what's my material? You can see I've still got a number of panels here that still think that they are steel. So I can come along and say, actually, all my material is pine, so I want to change my physical material. Small drawer, I want that to be pine. I want my large drawer to be pine, and you can see that now picks up and copies the information across because they were pretty much duplicates of each other. I want my drawer assemblies to be pine, and I want my other door assembly to be pine. And also let's create the back to be pine as well. So everything's now got the right physical material. Now the physical material is not actually important to rendering. What's important to rendering is the appearance, but that menu is there if you should want to update it. Close that down. Now notice here we don't have a command that says revert everything to original. If you go back into the design, you can see my position command has now appeared here in design, and it's just remembered what I've done in the rendering. So these two things are linked together. It's put all the pie information we want on there, and it's pulled all those drawers out. I want to put those back in, so position, revert, and that will close all my drawers, but it will still remember the material we've created. Okay, design, back into our render command, and again you can see that's linked and that's updated. Now let's pull out one of these drawers and let's have a look at something here. Let's zoom in. As it's created the appearance, although it's clever and it does actually use images of pine, it doesn't always get the orientation of the grain right. And look at this side panel here. See, the orientation is going up and down. That's not something I would want to happen. So I want to change the orientation of that grain. And that's why the second thing I do in my workflow is this command up here, texture map controls. Sets the orientation of the texture applied to the body or component. Select the object to modify, and then the projection type and the axis. Modify the mapping transform using the manipulator or fields in the dialog. Excellent, let's pick on that. Here's your menu, very simple to begin with. What do you want to manipulate? Select, that's component there, that side panel. Now what projection do you want? Do you want an automatic one, which is what it starts with and that's what it defaults into? Do you want a planar one, so I'll just create one face of that? Do you want a box one, where it actually manipulates all of the component as if a box was wrapped around it? Do you want to do it to a sphere, or do you want to do it to a cylinder? Well, I want to manipulate the entire side panel because that's a piece of timber in our world. It's not just an independent face. So I select box. The menu now extends a bit further. What's the display mode? Do you want to go for appearance or UV diagnostic textures? Now this shows how things react under ultraviolet light. It's a UV test. I don't tend to use it. It's not really relevant to woodworking, but if you're doing something different, you may want to explore that. All we care about is appearance. And then it says, so what do you want to change? Your x-axis, your y, your z, your angle. I ignore all of that and I go down here and play it by ear or play it by eye. You'll recognize these arrows. That will move everything up and down as a texture, and you can see that not appearing. That will move everything backwards and forwards as a texture. This one will move it sort of across the grain. You can see that not appearing on the end grain there. These two are important to us because they will rotate it. So I can say, actually, I want to grab that and rotate that grain. And you can see that grain rotating. So that grain is now in the right orientation. Now, the other thing that I like to do with this is to make things so they look a little bit different. If you look at these drawer fronts, everything here looks the same. It's got all the knots in the same place, and it's unlikely, unless you were doing bookmarking through a log, that was going to be the case. So I want to change that. So we go back into the texture map control. Let's select that front panel. Let's do box again. First of all, let's put the grain in the right place. It's remembered we changed the grain, so it's done that for us. And now let's just drag that up a bit. So let's do it something totally different and have, I don't know, that. That looks different, doesn't it? Now you don't need to come out of this. I can just click on the next piece now, and I want to change this one. I want to go into box, and let's drag this one. Let's reorientate the grain again. And let's make that, something like that, I think. Now let's go into this one. Again, we're going to go into box. Let's orientate the grain how we want it. In fact, let's flip that down completely. Let's go in this direction on this one. And let's put that over there. That's a nice contrast. And that end one is okay. Perfect. So we've now changed the grain bit on those front drawers, and straight away that looks a lot better. We've changed the texture on this drawer here. That one looks okay to me. That one looks okay. I'm just going to have the drawers like that. So 3 of the drawers are going to be slightly open for our picture, so I can manipulate and drag that around. Looking at these two doors, they're a bit samey for me, so let's change these. Back into our texture map controller, let's work on that panel first of all. Let's do a box again, and let's just move that so it looks something like that. Let's pick on this one. Let's move it so it looks something like that, so it's a bit different, but try and get a bit of a grain match going on. That looks nice. Let's have a look at this one here. Back into box again. I think we'll do something like that, and then let's do this bottom panel here. Back into box again, and let's just try and match the grain up and do something like that. Okay, so it's simply a matter of playing around with your grain surface using this texture map controller till you start to get something that looks authentic. Now have a look at these middle panels here, these middle shelves. The grain is running front to back, that's not very good, so let's change that. Back into my plane, let's select that shelf there. Let's go to box again, and let's just grab that little handle at the back and just spin the grain 180 degrees. That will look good. He says, having done it wrong. That's better. That's better. We'll spin this one as well. Just turn that around so it looks good. Let's just change these knots so they're not the same. Let's just get those out, something like that, I think. And then let's come along and change this one as well. Back into the box. Spin the grain around first of all, and now let's do something like, oh, I don't want to push it out completely, pick up a totally different pattern of wood. Think of something like that. Okay. This top one I don't like, so let's change the dimensions on that top selection. Again, we'll go to box and we'll just simply spin that grain, I think. Something like that. Maybe a few, oh look at that, maybe a few less knots, something like that would look good. Just noticed here, this is just showing through, the grain pattern on this top panel is in the wrong direction, so you can see it's got end grain there. So let's go ahead and change that as well. Let's go for box, and let's just change that grain pattern, something like that. It looks different, looks good to me. Yep. Okay. Now once I've got that, I want to pose this, because what you see on the screen is what it's going to render. So if you have your object in the distance, it will render it in the distance. So come up and get it sort of in a reasonable position. We can change that in a second, but something like that I think is going to be a reasonable distance. So play around with the grain, and obviously play around as much as you want to get the look and feel that's right for you, but I'm not unhappy with that. Then you want to come into the next thing, which is now going to be the scene settings. Set the environment and lighting for the scene. This section only affects the rendering workspace. So we change everything here, you're not going to see the background in design or any other workspace change. So let's check that menu. Now this menu looks quite complicated, but this is really affecting the background and the lighting and the ground plane. So environment, first of all, is brightness, and you can simply scale that up, and it's creating the brightness of your object. So you want to set your lighting to something that looks good, probably about where it was, 1095 is good. Now the background, you can have a solid colour, and you can come along and pick solid colours. So if you wanted a real contrast, you can come down and say actually make everything black, and that really makes your bookcase stand out. That might be something you want to do. You might be into very, very white backgrounds, so you don't want to apply it to a white background. Maybe you like red backgrounds. Choice is yours, and you can play around with the solid background. Very rare I use solid backgrounds. What I tend to use in the background is not a solid colour, but it's an environment. And we'll look at environments in a second on the environmental library. Now the next thing is, do I want a ground plane? And we'll come back to ground plane in a second. Now if I zoom right out, you can almost see on this background, I've got this sweeping line here which suggests this is like a grey piece of bent card, with this being the upper wall and this being the ground. That's what it's talking about. Do you want a ground plane inside there? Yes, we do. We'll come back to that. It's more obvious once we set up the scene, but I can flatten the ground, I can have reflections inside the ground, I can change the roughness of the ground plane, etc. We'll look at that shortly. Now, camera. What camera do you want? Do you want perspective? Do you want orthographic? Do you want perspective with ortho faces? And that's exactly what it would say. Exactly what it says on the tin. Now, orthographic I always hate when I'm doing 3D designs. Yes, it's probably realistic, but it looks stupid. I like perspective. Now, that's what I always tend to use. The choice is yours, but you can change the camera view. Focal length changes the type of camera you want, so you can have a different focal length, and just think of that as a camera lens. So you can have a very, very, very wide fisheye type lens, all the way through to a zoom lens that tends to flatten things out. I find that the standard 90mm lens is pretty good. It gives us what we want it to do. You can then change your exposure. If you know about photography, you know what that does. So this is a 9.8 aperture, 10.9, and that's changing how much light comes into your camera, and you can play around with that and the brightness to get the results you want. Now, your depth of field is exactly that. It's a depth of field. If you've got ray tracing enabled and you're doing your rendering, depth of field kicks in. Now, depth of field shows you where your focus is going to be, and you see I've got this little green dot here. See that? Now, what you do is you click your center of focus arrow and say, where do I want my depth of field? And can you see where I click? It's putting in that little green blob. That's where the camera is going to focus. So I came right down to this bottom right hand corner. That's where my camera would focus. And the blur aspect is what's going to be in focus. So I've got one at the moment. It doesn't really show up on this, but when you render it, if I had my blur all the way through, the unit would cut off very, very quickly and blur out. And if you've ever seen portrait photography where the face is very, very clear and the background is blurred, that's what it's talking about. I don't tend to use that per se because I want all of my cupboard to be in focus, so I don't tend to use depth of field, but that's what it would do. Aspect ratio is pretty important to us, so what do you want? Now, I tend to display these on widescreens, so I tend to go to a 16:9 ratio here, and you can start to see it's put these side borders in, and that's now showing what's going to be rendered. Anything inside that square is what's going to be rendered. If I brought it down to a 1:1 square, you can see it's very, very small, and if my cupboard was here, all this cupboard on the right hand side would be cut off. Landscape, portraits, custom aspect. I go to widescreen, and then I make sure that I pose my cupboard in the middle of the widescreen, something like that. So I'm beginning to see how my cupboard's going to look. Once that's done, you can save those as defaults, which I don't tend to do because I tune each and every project. Now, let's go to the environment library. This is that background that you can see, and at the moment it's currently selected as sharp highlights. Now, inside here you've got cool lights. Now, what's the background? If I click change the background, so grid lights, photo booth, you can see it's changed the background there. Now, I tend to like photo booth. It gives me a nice feature as well, and we'll come back to that in a second. Rim highlights, that's as you've got spotlights shining on it. Sharp highlights is the default one. Soft highlights, and what these are doing is actually setting the background, and it's putting the light conditions on this as well, just as if you were in a photography studio. Now, you can do other things as well. Let's download Crossroads for some random reason. Double click Crossroads, and now you can see that's put it in the middle of a roadway, basically on a crossroad. And you can actually import environments, but there's a certain type of file format to use, and I've never really played with that. But in theory, I could take a photograph of a customer's environment, and then I could drop this in and say, hey, you know, if you want to put your bookcase in the middle of a main road, that's what it would look like. As I say, I tend to use photo booth. Just experience shows me that that's better. Now, once I've selected my environment, come back into the settings, and there's this position underneath the environment, and highlight on that, and it gives me some scales here. So I can actually rotate the background now independently of my unit. So I can spin this round, and I can put the highlights where I want on this, and I quite like to get a sort of blackish background, almost like that, and then I can change the ground scale a little bit. So I just rotate this now until I get something that I think looks nice. And I like that because it showed me some interesting shadows just going to turn a little bit further. I want to get that ground scale so it's a bit blurred, so it's a bit further from the ground and we get a bit more of a contrast in. I like that, that's looking pretty good to me. Now it's a little bit bright, so I'm just going to knock the brightness down a little touch of the overall scene. Let's try 800, bit better. And you see these blue arrows appeared? That now shows me the position of the ground. So I want to bring the ground down a little bit, so it's not cutting anything off. Probably about -200. I'm going to flatten those ground textures off, and then I can just move the ground round a little bit to see where I want it to be. Maybe bring that forward. Yeah, that's looking quite good. And now I can just bring that in. Now that starts to give me the shadows and the light, and you can see the light glinting off these areas here. It starts to get a little light here on those dovetails. Maybe rotate that light around a little bit more. There you go, that's looking good. So you can now set up your lighting studio by playing around with these controls. So let's walk through that again. First thing I do is I choose the environment. I normally go for photo booth. That's a soft light with a nice greyish background. You can then change the brightness of this so it doesn't look too bright. So let's just drop that down a little bit, maybe 790, maybe 780. Yeah, that's not too bad. And then I can change the position of this. I can move the ground round in relationship to my drawing by grabbing the blue arrows, and I can rotate the background and the lights so they pick up the right accent for me, maybe that. And I can change the scale of the ground by zooming in and out, which just gives you the ability to change the look and feel of that. I can then choose whether I want a ground plane at all, so that will flatten it out. I can flatten the ground so the textures are flattened. I can put reflections on and off. I can change the perspective of the camera, the focal length of my camera, the exposure of my camera. In fact, I might just knock that exposure down a little bit. What was it, 8.8? 8.9? 9? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to change that to 9, and I want it in widescreen. Close that down. Okay, so now you can see I've got my photo studio set up. So I've changed my grain orientation, I've messed things around so it doesn't all look the same. I've posed my drawers and I've posed the position. I've changed the environment in the background and spun it around so my lights are good. And now the final thing, I'm just staging that within that frame, that sort of light grey background we've got there. And now I'm ready to, oh look at that top panel's changed. I'm going to come back in, just going to change that top panel, don't like that, box. For some reason the grain's changed orientation. I don't know how that happened. Okay, better. Right, I'm good to go. Next thing I want to do is to render it. So let's look at the in-canvas rendering first of all. In-canvas means it's going to render it on this screen as is, as opposed to render that's going to create you a downloadable picture of it. So to start, you just click the in-canvas rendering start button here, but let's look at the settings first of all. You've got a fast setting, materials and lighting are simplified, and advanced, they are not simplified. So advanced is going to give you a higher quality, fast is going to simplify your lights and give you a lower quality but a faster render. Now fast is good because I only want to see what it looks like. This is not my final render. It's an indication. So I'm going to bring the resolution down to somewhere about 50. I'm going to lock the view so when I move the control nothing changes. Click OK. Now I can start my rendering by clicking in canvas render. Now you can see it's slowly starting to build up that picture. You can see the reflection coming in there on the floor from that reflection setting that we created. And you can see the elapsed time down here in this corner as it starts to build that up. And the longer you leave it, the better that rendering is going to be. Now straight away I can say I don't like the reflections here. I want these reflections to be a bit closer. So I want to change the position of my cupboard in relationship to that ground plane. So let's pause at that render and go back to our scene setup. And I want to click on the position. And I just want to bring up that floor to that. And it's trying to keep up with me on the rendering here, which is quite useful So I'm just slowly bringing that up and saying, actually, I probably want that to be, do I want that to be 0? So it's actually resting on the floor. Let's try that. No, not really. So let's bring it up to there, I think. That looks quite good, doesn't it? So I've got those reflections now on my shiny floor, and I've got those reflections in the right position. So I think I quite like that. And you can see it's still trying to render. It's starting again now. So you can really get a view of what your render is going to look like. And I love these reflections on that shiny floor. I'm happy with that. Okay, so I'm going to close that down. Okay, so I think that's going to look good. So I'm happy with that render. So let's pause that rendering so it's not messing about on us. And now let's go to the teapot menu here and click on this render. Only one command, render. Create a high quality rendered image of your scene using cloud or local background rendering technology. Choose the desired image size, the settings, the cloud or local render, and click render to start the rendering process. Finished renderings will appear in your rendering gallery. That sounds good. Let's click on the teapot. Now the menu is pretty simple. A number of defaults across the top: web, mobile, print, video, or a custom option. If you click on this, it's the web, it's 800 by 600. That will set it all up for you. The only other thing you may want to choose is, do you want it to be a standard quality or a super final quality? And do you want to render in the Fusion Cloud that costs you credits and you buy credits, or do you want to render it on your computer, which is somewhat slower but is free? You then get an advanced setting menu here you can click on, and do you want it final or boost it all the way up to excellent? So you can now have an 800 by 600 rendering on your computer, super high quality, and you can now go and click render. Do you want to do it for a mobile device? Do you want to do it for a print device? Do you want to do it for a video? Or do you want to do a custom rendering? Now what I tend to do is actually go for video, and I tend to choose 1080p, and that's because I sometimes use these images in my YouTube production, so I just use that resolution. It just makes it the right size for me, I guess, the right shape. It's pretty big, 2.1 megapixel, but that's okay. I local render it because why wouldn't I? I've got a powerful machine, and I have it on excellent quality. And then you simply click render. I get a flag, local rendering is started. Once the rendering is complete, click the thumbnail in the rendering gallery to view the full image. So once it's ready, it will appear down here in my rendering gallery. So you can see that's now beginning to appear, and you can see I've got a line now of the overall progress, and that's going to take a little bit of time to render. So we'll let that cook. I'll make the cup of tea that it promises me as part of the rendering tool, and we'll come back and we'll have a look at that once it's completed. So there we go, rendering is complete. That took about 45 minutes overall. So come down to the rendering gallery, and now we can just double click on that, and then that opens up and gives us a view of the render. And as you can see, pretty nice, photo-realistic, or more or less. Now what I would say about doing the local render, you do miss out on a couple of features. You can see here, I've got this one here known as turntable, and I've got a feature here that looks at post-processing. If you were to click on the turntable, if you were to go ahead and render this in the cloud, you'd end up with a 3D image that you could actually rotate, where this is obviously a 2D image, and that can be really quite powerful in some situations. Post-processing would allow you to do some fine-tuning of your render, but once again, that's not available if you've used local rendering. But for what we're trying to achieve, a photorealistic image of something, I think personally that is good enough. If you don't like it, you can always go ahead and re-render. If you don't like it at all, you can delete. But let's download this. Click on the download button. Now that will bring up whatever your system menu is. I'll just put it down to my desktop for now and save that down. And there you go, you now have a high quality 3D rendered image of your project. And I think that's really powerful. Now this will actually stay down. You can see it's got version 15 against it. And up here, Bookcase Design, I'm actually on version 15. So if you wanted to change some of these panels, if I was to come into my door assembly left and I was to look at the raised panels here, let's come back into our appearance menu, and I'll just download a curly maple, no I won't, something dark. I'll download a glossy mahogany, and then I'm just going to come in and I'm going to say I want the raised panels to actually be mahogany. There you go, for some random reason. Now if I save this down, so I'm going to come to the save button, I'm going to save it as a new version, and let's just call that new panel. Okay, save that down, save to the cloud, and come back into my render pane. You'll see that it's updated here. So when I now re-render this image, it will give me a second thumbnail down here. It'll take another 45 minutes. But you can see how that could be quite powerful. So I can design once, I can render it in a material, and then I could add uplift features. So if you wanted this standard bookcase, it's going to be X amount of money. If you wanted mahogany panel inlays, this is what it would look like, and it'd be X amount of money. So you can design once, you can render many different ways by showing the appearance, and that will build up for you down here a catalogue of thumbnails that you can use. So there you go, that's the rendering feature inside Fusion 360. Super powerful and super useful. That's it for today. Next week we're going to finish off this series by looking at the drawings for the workshop. I'll see you then.